Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. Alright, let's take a breath and think about something that almost never gets talked about in the grimdark galaxy of Warhammer 40k. Not war, not chaos, not the endless screams echoing through the warp, but silence. Stillness. Worlds where the grass once grew in peace, where skies weren't choked by void ships or scarred by orbital fire. Places that existed before the Imperium, before the Emperor, before even the long-forgotten wars that broke the stars. Can you imagine that? A galaxy where some planets didn't just survive untouched, but thrived in ways we can barely comprehend now. It's easy to forget, with all the noise of exterminatus, hive cities, and cults, that there was a time when the stars didn't belong to man, or chaos, or even the ancient Zenos powers. There might still be places out there, pockets of life that have never been cataloged, never been terraformed, never been conquered or contaminated by the bootsteps of the Imperium. These are the Forgotten Edens. Not just myth or wishful thinking, but real possibilities, hidden by warp storms, camouflaged by Zenos technology, or simply ignored by a bureaucracy too bloated to notice what it's erasing. And that's where today's story begins. Not with a bolter shot or a warp rift, but with a quiet, persistent question. Are there still untouched worlds in this galaxy? Worlds where pre-Imperial life continues to grow, to evolve, to exist? Because if they are still out there, it changes everything. Not tactically, not politically, but spiritually. It reminds us that not every star was born to burn in war. Some, perhaps, were born just to shine. When people say a world has been touched by the Imperium, they don't always realize what that actually means. It sounds almost poetic, like a gentle hand brushing over the surface of a planet, but in reality, it's anything but. To be touched by the Imperium is to be claimed, categorized, stripped, and reformed, physically, culturally, biologically. It doesn't matter if it's a lifeless rock or a flourishing paradise. Once it falls under the gaze of the administratum, its fate is already sealed. Colonization in the Imperium is never just about settling a new place. It's an industrial operation, a spiritual mission, and a military occupation all rolled into one. The Mechanicus descends to evaluate mineral wealth and resource viability. The Departamento Munitorum assesses its logistical potential. The Ecclesiarchy prepares to purge local belief systems and implant the imperial creed. And that's the best-case scenario. In truth, most new worlds are first scouted by rogue traders and then militarized by Astra Militarum detachments, followed closely by servitors, construction units, and eventually entire hive spires built to mirror the soul-crushing architecture of Terra. Local ecosystems don't stand a chance. Native species are either harvested, hunted, or outright exterminated if deemed non-compliant with imperial interests. Forests are paved over with ferrocrete, rivers are diverted. The skies are darkened by industry. And it doesn't matter if a world is peaceful, self-sustaining, or even spiritually awakened in its own way. The Imperium doesn't value uniqueness unless it can be turned into weaponry or productivity. That's something that's always sat wrong with me. I've read logs of exploratory fleets encountering lush, self-contained biospheres with stunning biodiversity, entire planetary webs of life functioning in balance for tens of thousands of years. And what happens? Orders come down from above: sterilize, purify, build. There's no room for negotiation, no time for study. The assumption is that if humans didn't build it, it must be primitive or heretical. And here's the kicker. Even the most peaceful forms of contact eventually lead to irreversible change. Just a single shuttle's atmospheric disruption can trigger long-term damage in delicate ecosystems. The moment a Vox beacon is placed, migratory patterns of local fauna can be altered. Spores from off-world fungi can displace native plants. Tech adepts carrying microbiota from hive ships can contaminate entire jungles. Some fan theories even suggest that the terraforming protocols used by the Imperium include silent weaponization, subtle alterations to tilt planetary environments in favor of human life, while quietly eliminating anything unfit for the Imperial ideal. The Adeptus Terra calls this stability. They claim it brings order to chaos. But if you ask me and a lot of other lore diggers I talk with, we think it's just another kind of destruction. More clinical maybe, but no less brutal. I remember reading a transmission once, intercepted and partially censored, from an explorer fleet that landed on a world with floating mountain ranges and light-reactive plants that sang in frequencies too low for human ears. The logs were full of awe, the tech priests were speechless, and yet within a month, the same world was listed as cleared for mining protocol Theta. That entire ecosystem? Gone, deleted, filed under incompatible with strategic resources. There's also a deeper, almost ideological rot behind it all. The Imperium can't allow something beautiful to exist on its own terms. It needs to own it, define it, reshape it. That's why even relics of old Earth, things like natural oceans or animal sanctuaries, have either been obliterated or turned into exaggerated symbols under the control of the ecclesiarchy. Real nature, uncontrolled, unregulated, wild and free, it doesn't exist anymore where the Imperium has gone. And look, I get it. In a galaxy filled with demons, tyrannids, and worse, survival is priority number one. No one wants to risk that a peaceful-looking planet harbors a genestealer cult or an ancient AI god buried beneath its soil. But even so, the cost of that paranoia is staggering. We're not just talking about the loss of rare species or pretty landscapes. We're talking about the systematic erasure of entire ways of being, biological diversity, cultural depth, spiritual frameworks, all flattened under the boot of standardization. There are even those who argue that the Imperium doesn't just bring death, it brings sameness. Every hive world echoes the next. Every agri-world is just a series of template crops and machine-tended fields. Even feudal worlds are shaped into familiar molds to fit Imperial records. It's as though the galaxy has been subjected to an eternal copy-paste operation. And in doing so, we've lost more than we know. The Forgotten Edens, if they still exist, aren't just hidden, they're the last threads of something the galaxy once was, before the Age of Darkness, before compliance, before humanity decided that control was more important than wonder. The truth is, once the Imperium sets foot on a planet, nothing remains untouched. Not the soil, not the air, not the people. Every breath is filtered, every thought surveilled, every root system ripped up and restructured. That's what touched means in the 41st millennium. And if that doesn't terrify you a little, maybe you haven't looked closely enough at what we've already destroyed. Before the Imperium, before the Great Crusade, before even the Age of Strife, there was a galaxy alive in a way we can barely imagine now. It wasn't empty, and it certainly wasn't silent. Long before humanity carved its mark across the stars, the void teemed with life. Some of it intelligent, some of it primitive, all of it unique. And the thing that gets me? Most of that life didn't revolve around war or conquest. It just existed, evolved, flourished. Not everything needed a fortress monastery or a manufactorum. There were entire biospheres operating on laws completely foreign to our understanding of ecology. When we talk about pre-imperial life, we're usually referring to two overlapping categories. First, there's the life that evolved naturally on planets never colonized by humanity in the dark age of technology. Worlds that were left alone, either because they were out of range, hidden behind warp anomalies, or simply overlooked. The second category is trickier. It includes life from civilizations that existed before the Imperium and even before mankind took to the stars in earnest. These could be ancient Zenos species, long-forgotten human offshoots, or entirely non-sentient systems of life with their own complex interactions. One of the most famous examples people bring up is the old Terra myth of the Jardan coral spires, a supposedly sapient plant system that used light-based communication and formed continent-sized colonies across oceans. There's no solid record of where this came from or if it even existed, but some explorator logs hint at photosynthetic life forms that could generate structured noise patterns resembling language. Others talk about glass-skinned serpents from the rimward halo that existed in mutualistic relationships with floating balloon-like trees, feeding off their sap in exchange for protection from ultraviolet bursts during solar flares. These ecosystems weren't just strange, they were symphonic. Every species had a role, and the balance was so tight that even a single invasive organism could disrupt the harmony. And then there's the weird stuff. Things like the walking hills of Gael Narun, entire geological formations supposedly composed of fungal composites and primitive nervous systems. They moved across the landscape in seasonal migrations, shaping terrain as they went. No roads, no machines, just slow, breathing tectonic life. I remember someone on a lore forum once described them as the galaxy's memory foam, adapting over millennia to the environments around them. The idea that such worlds existed before we ever charted the stars? It's haunting. Fan theories go even deeper. There's a small but passionate group who believe that some of these ecosystems weren't just natural. They were engineered, not by humans, but by precursor species like the old ones. These theorists claim that certain pre-imperial biospheres were artificial ecosystems seeded as part of galactic-scale experiments, either to stabilize warp resonance or to maintain order in planetary ley lines. It sounds like tinfoil hat territory, but then again, the old ones did manipulate life on a massive scale during the War in Heaven. Maybe not all their experiments were destroyed. Maybe some kept growing. And honestly, it wouldn't surprise me. You've got fragments of data in Mechanicus archives talking about photosynthetic slime that displayed problem-solving behavior. There's the infamous Whisperwood incident on Calth Minor, where an entire forest allegedly mimicked the heartbeat rhythms of nearby explorers, inducing hallucinations and spiritual euphoria. Reports said it predated any colonization attempt, and some argued it was a sentient form of worship. What do we even call that? Flora? Fauna? Religion? The frustrating part is that we'll never know how much has already been erased. So much of this pre-imperial life was undocumented, or worse, deliberately purged from records. The early phases of the Great Crusade didn't have time for natural history. They were looking for compliance, not conservation. And those first-wave expedition fleets didn't just burn down civilizations, they burned down entire ecosystems. If a planet didn't meet strategic viability metrics, it was often used as a weapons test site or seeded with imperial flora to create agri-worlds. Native life didn't stand a chance. But there are whispers, fragments of recovered data or isolated voxcasts. Things like habitat resonance anomalies or biological synchronicity zones. Places where pre-imperial life might still linger in some hidden canyon, some quarantined moon, some forgotten valley inside a death world no one bothered to finish cataloging. These are the cracks in the concrete armor of the Imperium, the places where old life still breathes, quietly and defiantly. And yeah, maybe it's all speculation. Maybe we're just grasping at vines in the dark, trying to find something pure in a galaxy that hasn't known peace for over 10,000 years. But I think that's the point. Even if only one such world still exists, even if its forests have never heard the echo of last fire or the drone of a servo skull, it means the galaxy hasn't been completely consumed. It means something survived the madness. In a universe this vast, surely something made it through untouched. And maybe that's the most beautiful tragedy of all. That somewhere out there, a world still sings a song no human has ever heard, and no one ever will. You can't really dive into the mystery of forgotten worlds without stumbling into the shadow of House Cadillacs. And I know, not everyone even believes they were real. They're more of a myth whispered about in data slates no one wants to officially acknowledge. An old noble cartographica house that supposedly cataloged the stars long before the Imperium ever codified the galaxy under its imperial mapping systems. But for those of us who obsess over the lost corners of the void, the name keeps coming up again and again, like a ghost in the machine. The story goes like this. During the tail end of the Age of Strife, before the Emperor had even unified Terra, a proto-navigational order known as the Cadillacians began documenting planetary systems in the outer spiral arms, far beyond what the Imperium now considers mapped territory. They weren't soldiers or priests. They were archivists, chroniclers, wanderers. Some say they were even gene-forged to withstand long-range warp exposure. Their goal wasn't conquest, it was memory. They wanted to understand the patterns of the galaxy, its life, its movement, its hidden order. Some of their records were said to be encoded in language geometry hybrids that only certain cogitators could parse. Weird stuff. Weird, but haunting. And then suddenly they were gone. What's left of them survives in the form of corrupted data cores, partially decoded vox fragments, and mention in the footnotes of obscure Mechanicus treatises. But the part that really gets under my skin is how many worlds were logged by their maps, and then just vanished from history. You can actually trace it if you dig through the right old star charts. A few early Crusade expeditions report landing on systems with Cadillacian markers, worlds supposedly bursting with life, some even bearing signs of stable pre-Imperial civilizations, and then nothing. No follow-up logs, no status updates, not even a cleansed stamp or exterminatus completed. Just silence, as if those planets were swallowed whole. There's this one example I always come back to, System Lyrae Tertius. It appears once in a chart dated to the early days of Mandeville Point recalibration, labeled Zone Violet, Biohazard Exceptionally Anomalous. The scan data shows unusually consistent atmospheric rhythms and an entire moon covered in reflective crystalline growth. Sounds like something worth investigating, right? Except no official expedition ever followed up. It was later listed as navigational anomaly, removed from maps pending recalibration. That's bureaucrat speak for, we saw something we didn't like and decided to pretend it wasn't there. A lot of fans speculate that House Cadillacs encountered things the Imperium didn't want preserved, not because they were dangerous, though maybe some were, but because they didn't fit. Worlds that defied classification. Biomes that didn't follow expected terra patterns. Maybe even pockets of reality that warped time or consciousness in subtle ways. The kind of places that whispered truths the ecclesiarchy couldn't allow to spread. You can almost see the purge process in action. First, a world is marked. Then a data silence order is issued. Then, if someone brings it up again, they're either redirected or reassigned. The records aren't deleted, but buried. Sidelined in the archives of archives. Digital tombs. There's a rumor, I don't even know where it started, that the descendants of Cadillacs still exist. Not in name, but as a splinter sect of explorators who wander the stars collecting fragments of erased planetary records. They supposedly store this information inside psychically shielded memory vaults, far beyond Imperial space. Whether it's true or not, I love that idea. That someone, somewhere, is still trying to remember the things we chose to forget. And here's something that chilled me the first time I read it. In one obscure scrap of Cadillacian code, translated by a rogue tech savant and posted on a restricted network for about 12 hours before it was wiped, there's a phrase that stuck with me. No star burns alone. What is forgotten still remembers. Make of that what you will, but it sounds like a warning, or maybe a promise. You start to wonder if some of these worlds didn't just vanish, but hid, or were hidden by forces far older than the Imperium. Zenos civilizations with cloaking technology beyond our comprehension, warp storms seeded artificially to isolate them. Or maybe, in the most haunting theory of all, these worlds erased themselves. Closed themselves off from a galaxy too cruel to bear. Chose silence over assimilation. It's terrifying to think how much history we've paved over with ignorance and fear. That there are planetary systems we once knew, touched, even studied, then decided to forget. Not because they weren't valuable, but because they didn't serve the machine. The Mechanicus has a term for this, Archodenialism. It's the act of purposefully suppressing knowledge that contradicts established orthodoxy. And I believe the Cadillacian maps were one of its earliest victims. In a galaxy obsessed with control, knowledge is a threat. And the worlds documented by House Cadillacs might be the purest form of threat imaginable. Proof that humanity isn't the beginning, or the center, or even particularly special. Just one chapter in a much older, more intricate galactic narrative we no longer want to read. There's this theory that's floated around the more esoteric corners of the lore community. One of those strange, beautiful ideas that sticks with you even if you don't fully believe it. People call it the light before light, or sometimes just the first shine. It's not in any official Imperial archive, and most Mechanicus Lex mechanics would probably scoff at it as pre-Enlightenment nonsense. But the thing is, it won't go away. It lingers in coded dreams, in broken Vox transmissions, in the mutterings of Astartes chaplains who have seen too much of the void. And I think there might be something to it. The basic idea is this: long before the first human ever left Terra, before the Old Ones or even the Necrontire waged their war across the stars, there were worlds already glowing, not with industry or power, but with some kind of intrinsic harmony. Garden worlds, not planted by any hand, but shaped by the natural forces of the universe in ways we no longer understand. Not just ecosystems, but entire planetary personalities. Worlds that were conscious, or close enough that the difference didn't matter. Some fans think these were never meant to be found, never meant to be mapped. They existed in that primal era when the warp was still calm and the stars whispered instead of screamed. You get stories of Astartes librarians dreaming of floating cities made of light and water, suspended in endless auroras. A few even claim these dreams hit them before their initiation into the Librarius, like echoes reaching backward through time. The more superstitious among us say the light before light isn't a theory at all, but a memory buried so deep in the human noosphere that it only leaks out in visions and madness. I once read a post on a forgotten forum written by a supposed former astropath who'd been severed from the choir due to psychic instability. He claimed that in the moments between warp touches, those tiny flickers of silence between the howls, he saw gardens. Not metaphorical ones, actual gardens. Massive fractal structures of color and sound, stretching across continents. He described one world where the rain fell in perfect harmonic patterns, causing the ground itself to hum, and another where floating organisms orbited each other in precise mathematical dances, as if life was performing equations in real time. He said they weren't hallucinations. They were broadcasts. Ancient planetary memories leaking through the veil. And then there are the artifacts. Bits and pieces of impossible architecture found buried beneath planets that supposedly had no prior inhabitants. Strange glass pyramids that resonate with pulse patterns no Imperial sensor can decode. Fossilized plants that appear to be hybrids of crystalline and organic matter. Impossible combinations that suggest intentional cross-design, not evolution. One expedition found something like a tuning fork the size of a cathedral lodged in a tectonic fault line, made of a material that defies known classifications. The Mechanicus tried to replicate it. They failed. Of course, the official line is that these are either Zenos constructs or rogue terraforming projects from the dark age of technology. That's the safety net answer. But more than a few rogue scholars think these fragments are leftovers from the light before light, that they're not alien at all, but part of a natural order that predates structured civilization. Imagine a universe where planets didn't just host life, they created it with purpose, sculpted it like a musician writing a symphony. One of the more poetic theories I've seen comes from a fringe Adepta Sororitas archivist. She wrote that the Emperor himself may have drawn inspiration from these worlds, that his vision of humanity's perfection wasn't forged in ambition alone, but in a longing for something he once glimpsed and could never return to. She called it a cosmic homesickness, a divine nostalgia. It's wild speculation, sure, but there's something heartbreakingly human about it. There's also the idea that the light before light didn't just exist. It's still out there. Hidden behind the densest warp storms, sealed off by ancient Zenos technologies, or folded into the fabric of real space through dimensional tricks we can't even begin to untangle. Some even say that the webway may contain passages to these untouched realms, deliberately masked or left inaccessible to prevent their corruption. A place that not even chaos can reach, a sanctuary in a galaxy long stripped of sanctuaries. But then you have to wonder, if they do still exist, why hasn't anyone found one? Or have they? There are scattered stories, almost always ending in tragedy, of expeditions that claim to have touched paradise, only to disappear. Amagos once reported discovering a perfect biome on a moon with no star. When the retrieval fleet arrived, there was nothing. Not even wreckage. The moon was sterile, as if the moment it was seen, it folded itself away or erased us. And that's the part that makes my spine crawl. What if these worlds can choose to hide? Whether you believe in the light before light or not, it speaks to something ancient in all of us. A yearning for beauty that doesn't need explanation. A memory of a time when life wasn't about survival or conquest or dogma, but just being. And maybe, just maybe, that memory isn't ours. Maybe it belongs to the galaxy. Maybe we're just echoes walking on broken ground, and the real story lies in the places we've never seen, and maybe never will. Whenever the topic of untouched worlds comes up, there are a few names that always float to the surface, like ghost signals in the void. Not officially acknowledged by the Adeptus Terra, of course, but whispered about in navigators' journals, scavenged fragments of Mechanicus logs, and the paranoid mutterings of rogue traders who swear they've seen things they weren't supposed to. 3 names come up more than any others: Utaria, Miranda, and the Western Forgotten Reach. Whether they're real, half-true, or total fabrications wrapped in superstition, they've become icons of the galaxy's hidden innocence, shreds of a past that still might be alive. Utaria is probably the most commonly mentioned, especially in navigator circles. Supposedly located just beyond the edge of Segmentum Obscurus, it's a system that flickers in and out of star charts, always reported in slightly different coordinates. That alone is enough to make people suspicious. It's like the void doesn't want it to be found. But navigators who've passed near the region tell similar stories. A psychic silence so complete it feels unnatural, and a sense of pressure, like being watched by something ancient but passive. One story I always go back to comes from a 3rd-generation Navis nobilate who claimed their astropath saw a ring of golden forests from orbit just before the warp route collapsed into instability. No industrial signatures, no signs of human colonization, just nature, layered in colors no imperial sensor could properly define. Of course, skeptics say that was just a misreading of warp distortion, but others point to consistent biopattern anomalies in the area. Some even claim that Utaria isn't just untouched, it's protected. That some force, maybe pre-imperial or even non-corporeal, has sealed the system away. There's a particularly out-there theory that it's actually a lost Eldar maiden world, hidden from both the Imperium and the craft worlds themselves. That one's wild, but honestly, in this galaxy, wild doesn't mean wrong. Sometimes it just means we haven't suffered enough to understand it yet. Then there's Miranda, a planet that appeared once in an explorator vessel's long-range probe telemetry. The data was corrupted, of course, but there were still clear heat signatures and moisture patterns that didn't match any known terraformed profile. The planet was described as biofluctuant, with an ecosystem that seemed to adjust itself around the presence of foreign tech. One log fragment even noted that the probe itself was gently deconstructed mid-flight, its components absorbed into a glimmering canopy of semi-organic growths. If true, that would suggest a level of planetary awareness almost unheard of outside of Tyranid hives. Except, in this case, without aggression. Just redirection. What makes Miranda especially compelling is the sheer absence of further data. After that first and only signal, no ship could find the system again. It's as if it phased out of real space entirely. Mechanicus analysts labeled it a pseudo-spectral anomaly, which basically means we don't know and we're not going to ask again. But some rogue xenobotanists believe Miranda may be the result of a stable presentient biome, something shaped by millions of years of uninterrupted natural evolution, forming a collective organism spread across the whole planet. Not a hive mind, not a predator, just a caretaker, a planet that chooses not to be found. And finally, the Western Forgotten Reach. It's less a specific world and more a cluster of systems so poorly charted they're referred to in plural. Imperial cartographs just label the region Dark Fringe T. But if you're digging around old nav recorder dumps or cross-referencing the data junk uploaded from dying rogue trader vessels, you'll find recurring references. Lush archipelagos, mountain-sized insect shells, light storms mimicking human faces. There's even one transmission, cut halfway through a sentence, that simply ends with, "We're not alone," and they've never heard of war. Now obviously, there's no consensus on what or who lives in the Forgotten systems. Some say it's a null civilization, beings that achieve post-material existence and live as environmental phenomena. Others think it's a kind of galactic quarantine zone, established by an ancient power to protect presentient life from the horrors of the wider universe. The most poetic theory, though, is that the Reach contains the last true Eden worlds that have never been colonized, terraformed, or scarred by war. Not even once, just pure, original life, untouched for hundreds of thousands of years. If that's true, they might hold answers to questions the Imperium doesn't even know how to ask. What fascinates me is how every one of these places seems to avoid attention. They don't call out, don't scream across the void like corrupted worlds begging for help. Instead, they stay silent, hidden, patient, and maybe that's why they've survived. In a galaxy full of empires and gods and extinction events, it's the quiet things that endure, the things that don't want anything from us, that don't need us. And that's the bittersweet part, right? If Utaria, Miranda, and the Forgotten Reach are real, we may never be able to reach them. Not because they're too far, but because we've already become the very thing they've hidden from. Maybe these worlds aren't lost. Maybe they're just saying no. There's this creeping fear that hits you when you start pulling on threads like these, when you realize that maybe we have found some of these untouched worlds, these forgotten Edens, and maybe we didn't just walk away. Maybe we erased them. And when I say we, I don't mean you and me. I mean the ones who hold the levers, the ones who decide what's remembered and what's never even spoken of. I'm talking about the exo-archivists, the red-robed data purifiers of the Mechanicus, and the faceless erasers some call the exorcinators. Now, there's no official record of an exorcinator order, of course. It's a name whispered on obscure dataspheres, in corrupted Vox files recovered from ships that should have never left dock. But the theory goes like this: these are not assassins or soldiers. They're information executioners. Specialists deployed when the Imperium or its allies stumble across something too clean, too pure, too dangerous. Not because it threatens us physically, but because it threatens the very idea that the galaxy belongs to mankind and mankind alone. If a planet proves that life can thrive without the Imperium, without the Emperor, without Terra, well, that's a kind of heresy that burns deeper than chaos. There's this story, maybe a myth, maybe not, about an explorator fleet that discovered a moon orbiting a gas giant in Segmentum Pacificus. According to recovered notes, the moon was covered in bioluminescent vegetation, reacting to thought patterns. It mirrored the emotional states of the crew as they walked its surface. No signs of Zenos, no architecture, no ruins, just a biosphere in perfect harmony, too perfect. The logs cut off halfway through an entry, and the next known transmission from that region was a completely redacted communique, marked with the sigil of a Mechanicus protocol known only as Athanatheum. The moon has never appeared on a chart since, and then there's the Mechanicus itself. For all their reverence toward knowledge, their obsession with preservation, there's a quiet understanding among lore diggers that the Adeptus Mechanicus only preserves what aligns with the cult's truth. Everything else, either sealed or scrubbed. I've seen records where entire planetary classifications were downgraded to non-viable after an explorator mission returned with scans of flora that displayed low-level self-awareness. Not because it was dangerous, but because it couldn't be dissected and archived by conventional means. One theory even suggests that certain worlds are labeled tech heretic zones, not for what they contain, but for what they lack. No ruins, no scrap, no archaeotech. Nothing to tie them to the human legacy, which makes them, in the eyes of Mars, irrelevant, or worse, inconvenient. And that's the thing that keeps me up some nights. The idea that even if someone stumbled on an untouched paradise, they'd be silenced before they could ever tell anyone. There are examples, redacted ones but still traceable, where a world is mentioned in passing in an early scout log and then never appears again. No follow-up, no mention of exterminatus or reassignment. Just gone, like it was never there. You start seeing patterns in the silence. Some fan circles even joke about the blank index, a theoretical codex of planets that used to exist in Imperial records but have since been purged. Not by time, not by chaos, but by order. That's the part that stings most, that the erasure is deliberate, not a symptom of war or corruption, but a choice. A quiet, bureaucratic murder. And sometimes it's not even the Mechanicus doing the wiping. There's talk of black armored agents with no livery, no rank, no official designation, boarding ships unannounced, and departing with whole cogitator cores. No explanation, just blank stares and quiet threats. One report, ripped from a ship's internal Vox log, features a terrified adept whispering, "They said if we speak of the trees again, we'll become part of them." That's all, that's the whole log. But it hits hard. Not because it's loud, but because it's so specific. Even the Inquisition plays its part. Not always directly, but through silence. There are documented cases, real ones, where inquisitorial review was cited in the closure of planetary expeditions, even when no Zenos, heresy, or warp anomalies were reported. The expeditions were simply recalled, their data sealed under inquisitorial lock. That's not standard procedure. That's burying something. And here's the scary part. Some people think the cover-ups are protection, that these untouched worlds have something in them, something that resists integration, not malevolently, but passively. Some say they radiate a kind of psychic stasis, freezing thought, disarming aggression. One fringe psyker even claimed that after touching the soil of one such world, he forgot what war was for a full standard hour. Imagine that. Imagine forgetting war. Now imagine what the Imperium would do to that place. The truth is, the Imperium has never been good at handling exceptions. It doesn't tolerate beauty unless it can be displayed in a reliquary. It doesn't preserve what it doesn't understand. And it certainly doesn't allow narratives that question the necessity of its own existence. That's why these places, if they're real, aren't just rare. They're dangerous, because they whisper the one thing the Imperium cannot allow anyone to believe, that there was, or could still be, another way. So even if someone found one of these untouched worlds, even if they recorded every moment and tried to share it, they'd be erased. Not for treason, not for heresy, but for hope. And that, in this galaxy, is the deadliest crime of all. Every time we talk about untouched worlds, the conversation always starts with nature. Lush forests, unbroken skies, pristine rivers, ecosystems left to flourish without human hands. But at some point, the question always slips in, quiet but heavy. What if something intelligent lived there? Not just animals or alien plants, but actual thinking beings. Zenos species, sentient or near-sentient, that evolved in complete isolation from the Imperium, from war, from the long shadow of humanity. What kind of cultures would they create? What would their philosophies look like? Their architecture, their language? It's not a wild stretch either. We already know the galaxy was ancient long before humans started throwing lasguns at each other. The war in heaven between the Old Ones and the Necron didn't just break the stars, it left behind cracks. And life, being what it is, always finds its way into the cracks. So maybe somewhere out there, far from warp routes and patrol paths, are Zenos civilizations that were never conquered, never uplifted, never exterminated. They just kept growing, quietly, carefully, out of sight. One theory that really caught my imagination was about the Kanahari. It's a purely fan-made idea, but the depth of it is stunning. The idea is that the Kanahari are a photosynthetic humanoid species who evolved in symbiosis with their planet's biome, meaning their bodies change slightly with the seasons, both physically and emotionally. In spring, they become more extroverted and social. In winter, more introspective and still. They build cities from living material, tuning the growth of trees and coral-like stone through harmonic vibrations. Their entire culture revolves around resonance, balance, and a sense of cosmic timing. No weapons, no hierarchy, just a collective rhythm that has held steady for millions of years. And it worked, precisely because they were never found. Imagine that. An entire species that never needed to discover violence. Not because they're naive, but because their world never demanded it. Their evolution selected for harmony, not dominance. That's the kind of concept that the Imperium would immediately declare heretical. Not because it's dangerous, but because it's possible. And then, you've got the fractured whispers about echo cultures. Zenos civilizations that branched off from extinct races and developed in total isolation. Like the rumor of an offshoot from the lair that went feral in the void and developed an oral culture made entirely of echoed sound patterns. Their cities are described as towers of echo chambers, carved from asteroid stone, resonating with layer upon layer of voice memories. They don't write, they don't record, they remember by sound, and supposedly the echoes themselves become sentient over time, forming a kind of memory consciousness that guides their societal decisions. It's so far removed from anything imperial that it almost feels unreal. And maybe that's why it's so compelling. Because these kinds of ideas aren't just about what exists out there. They're about what we've forgotten how to imagine. There's even speculation that some of these isolated Zenos cultures don't look alien in the way we expect. That over countless millennia, life converges towards similar physical forms because of shared environmental pressures. Maybe some of them look like us, or like us through a mirror, smooth-skinned, bipedal, expressive, but with eyes that shimmer too long, or voices that carry notes we can't fully hear. It's eerie to think about how close we might be to these beings, evolutionarily speaking, and yet how utterly unreachable. And what would their societies believe? Without imperial dogma, without chaos corruption, without the trauma of constant war, how would they perceive life, death, purpose? Would they worship the stars? Would they even need religion? One fan theory talks about a species that believes thought itself is a planetary phenomenon, that sentient minds are just temporary ripples on the consciousness of their world. They don't fear death because they think they return to the planetary mind stream. No soul, no emperor, no afterlife, just dissolution into the collective dream. Can you imagine what would happen if an imperial expedition actually made contact with a culture like that? Would they study it? Of course not. They'd call it abomination, they'd label it a psyker anomaly, they'd send in the purifiers and call it a day. And yet, in that single act, they'd erase something irreplaceable. A worldview that humanity in all its billions could never have come up with on its own. And it's not all utopian fantasy. Some of these theorized cultures might be terrifying in their own right, not hostile, necessarily, but so alien in their morality that coexistence would be impossible. A race that sees memory as pollution, for instance, and ritually purges all history every 100 years. Or beings that grow new minds for every stage of life, shedding identities like we shed skin. Or a society where individuality is seen as a contagious illness. These ideas don't fit our narrative, but that doesn't make them wrong, it just makes them different. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the real danger of these untouched Zenos civilizations isn't military or psychic. Maybe the danger is philosophical. They represent lives that never needed the Imperium to function. Worlds where war wasn't the default setting. Cultures that found peace without conquest. And that's a threat you can't purge with a bolter. If they're out there, still living, still growing, then the galaxy hasn't been completely rewritten. There are still alternate endings, hidden away in quiet corners. And maybe, if we ever get brave enough to listen instead of conquer, we'll find out what we could have been, had we evolved in silence too. The Imperium doesn't fear untouched worlds because of what they are. It fears them because of what they prove. That's the quiet horror buried under all the ritual and dogma and fanfare. A world that has never known the Emperor, never seen a bolter, never been branded with the Aquila, and yet still functions, still thrives, maybe even flourishes in ways we've forgotten are possible. That kind of place isn't just an anomaly, it's a contradiction. A living argument against everything the Imperium says is necessary for survival. Ideologically, it's a direct threat. The Imperial Creed is built on the idea that humanity only survives through faith, obedience, and sacrifice, that without the Emperor's light, the species will collapse into ruin and chaos. But if there's a planet out there where humans, or even Zenos, live peacefully, without servitude, without constant war, without needing the church or the Mechanicus to guide them, then maybe the creed isn't absolute. Maybe it's just a cage dressed up as salvation, and that thought is heretical in the deepest, most visceral way. It doesn't tempt people with corruption or mutation, it tempts them with hope. With the idea that all this suffering might not be the only way. That's far more dangerous than any demon or heretic could ever be. You can kill rebellion with a bolter. You can silence a heretic with fire. But an idea? A working alternative? That's a poison you can't burn out once it spreads. Even biologically, these worlds pose a challenge. The Mechanicus doesn't like anything it didn't build or approve. Their entire understanding of life is filtered through templates, standard template constructs, sacred blueprints from the dark age of technology. If something doesn't match a known STC, it's either useless, dangerous, or both. Now imagine they find an untouched world where evolution took a different path, where ecosystems developed entirely new principles, where intelligent life didn't require augmentation or servitude to exist. Maybe these beings heal without tech, communicate through neural resonance, or manipulate energy through biotic systems that make plasma weapons look crude. To the Mechanicus, that's not fascinating. It's offensive. It undermines the whole idea of sacred knowledge, because it shows that knowledge didn't just come from Mars, it came from life. From a process the cult Mechanicus doesn't control, doesn't understand, and, perhaps worst of all, can't replicate. And that makes these places dangerous by definition. Not because they're hostile, but because they work. And if they work, maybe the Omnissiah doesn't hold all the answers after all. Then there's the strategic side of it, which is somehow even darker. The Imperium is built on fear and control. Every citizen, every world, every breath is accounted for. Even the act of dreaming is filtered through propaganda. Utopias, true utopias, short-circuit that machinery. If a guardsman hears about a planet where there are no tithes, no servitors, no endless war, where people live full lives and choose their destinies, what happens to his will to fight? What happens to loyalty when a better option is more than a dream? That's why the Imperium doesn't let these stories live. They're not just purged, they're unwritten. No one must know that harmony exists, that peace might be sustainable, that faith isn't the only path to purpose. Because the second people start believing there's another way, the gears stop turning. The hive grinders slow, the shrines gather dust, and the dream of an eternal Imperium begins to crack. I've read theories that some untouched worlds were never even contacted because high-ranking officials feared what they'd find. Not because they expected enemies, but because they feared not finding them. They feared seeing something better. One inquisitor, unconfirmed of course, was said to have turned a whole expedition fleet around after an astropath caught glimpses of a city filled with laughter. Not just order, not just efficiency, joy. The logs were sealed, the coordinates erased, and the story passed around as a cautionary tale. Not of failure, of temptation. And honestly, I think that fear is justified. If even one of these worlds is real, truly real, it makes a mockery of the High Lords, of the ecclesiarchy, of every saint and sermon that's ever justified cruelty in the name of survival. It turns the Imperium from a necessity into a choice. And choices are dangerous in a system built on obedience. So yes, they fear these worlds, not because they're armed, not because they resist, but because they remind us of what we lost and what we might still become. They are echoes from a timeline that could have been, and maybe still could be, if we ever found the courage to listen. And in a galaxy ruled by silence, that kind of noise is the deadliest heresy of all. It's one thing to believe these untouched worlds exist, it's another to go looking for them. And yet, across the millennia, people have. Not just rogue traders and wild-eyed prophets, but respected figures, archaeoxenologists, sanctioned navigators, even inquisitors, who've gone into the void chasing stories no one else dared to follow. Some left traces behind. Coordinates, sketches, partially decrypted data crypts. Others vanished entirely, their expeditions swallowed by warp storms or bureaucracy. But the pattern is there, if you know how to look. A quiet, obsessive undercurrent of people who wanted to find the last pure places in the galaxy, and sometimes maybe came too close. One of the most intriguing cases is the Delos initiative, a private endeavor led by Magos Emeritus Vexthelanus, a fringe archaeoxenologist who believed that certain signal frequencies embedded in warp noise corresponded to the emotional patterns of sentient planetary minds. Most of his work was dismissed as tech heresy, especially his belief that planets themselves could dream. But he had resources, influence, and a team. They charted a course to the Veiled Crescent, a cluster of barely mapped stars near the edge of the halo zone, following what Thalanis called echopulses, short-lived warp harmonics that didn't match any known celestial behavior. The last message from the Delos team was a half-corrupted Vox file that ended mid-sentence. It mentioned sky roots, weeping stone formations, and something described only as the Hush. No wreckage was ever found. Official reports state they were lost to a gravitic collapse, but there's a recovered data slate attributed to one of Thalanis's junior adepts that includes a scrawled phrase repeated over and over: "We weren't meant to see it. We weren't meant to see it." Then there's the case of navigator savant Orion de Belmont, who supposedly compiled a private star map of what she called resonance voids, dead zones in the warp where astropaths report vivid dreams of clear skies, warm light, and the sensation of being watched not with malice, but curiosity. Belmont's chart was passed around in secret among rogue navigators, and some even say it contains real coordinates. She vanished on her 6th voyage. Her ship, the Starlace, was found adrift a decade later, empty. Not destroyed, just empty. No bodies, no logs. But the plants in the hydroponics bay were blooming, untouched, as if someone had been caring for them until moments before the ship was found. And then there are the Inquisitors. You'd think they'd be the last people to go searching for beauty. But not all Inquisitors are hammer-swinging zealots. Some of them are scientists, philosophers, heretics with badges. One name that comes up more than once in this context is Inquisitor Elira Vecht. She was known for her obsession with pre-Imperial ruins and discontinuities in documented evolution. Basically, biological or cultural phenomena that didn't match up with established history. According to scattered references in redacted files, she believed that somewhere out there, untouched civilizations had survived the Age of Strife, insulated by warp storms or protected by Zenos artifacts. Her last known mission took her into the dead-fold expanse, a region of space declared non-navigable by the Navis Nobilite due to shifting psychic anomalies. She took a small escort and vanished without a trace. What's strange is what happened afterward: a full inquisitorial audit of her holdings, a recall of all data recovered by her prior expeditions, and the sudden reassignment or disappearance of her entire research staff. The official cause of her disappearance was listed as warp implosion due to navigational error. But the files around her name remain classified at a level that even other Inquisitors reportedly need special clearance to access. That level of lockdown usually means one of two things: chaos, or something much worse to the ideology of the Imperium, something that questions the Foundation itself. And still, people keep trying. There's a quiet movement in the deeper layers of the Mechanicus, young data clerks and fringe magi who piece together corrupted logs and old expedition charts, dreaming of the day they can launch a search pilgrimage. It's half forbidden and half romanticized. They don't want conquest. They don't want to claim or purify. They just want to see it, to prove it's real. Some even say they're part of a hidden sect called the Ocularis Lumen, a so-called Order of the Eye, sworn to watch for signs of worlds the Imperium forgot. You'll find references in the oddest places: a footnote in a treatise on warp-light behavior, a misplaced star system in an old chart that flickers for half a second before auto-correcting, poems encoded in data structure, testimonies left behind in the death diaries of rogue traders who died with a smile and no explanation. They all point to one thing: someone's always looking, and someone always wants them to stop. I remember a quote I found once, scribbled in the margins of a forbidden volume salvaged from a burned library. It read, "The stars remember what we've chosen to forget, and the brave still listen." I don't know who wrote it. Maybe it doesn't matter. What matters is that, despite everything, people are still trying, despite the silence, despite the fear, despite the Imperium's need to erase anything that doesn't bleed or burn. Somewhere out there, a world might still wait. And maybe, just maybe, one of those expeditions made it. Maybe they saw it, maybe they stayed, maybe they became part of it. That's the hope that keeps the search alive. That's the dream. And like all good dreams in the grim darkness of the far future, it's dangerous enough to be worth dying for. Sometimes I let myself imagine it. Not in the usual way: no fanfare, no invasion fleets, no triumphant return to Terra with a miracle in chains. Just someone finding it. A lone surveyor, a drifting rogue trader, a runaway navigator with coordinates no one believes. They land, they step out, and there it is. A real Eden. A world so untouched, it hums. Not just alive, but conscious, unburned, unmarred, complete. You know that feeling you get when you stand in a forest and everything's so still it feels like the trees are listening? Imagine that. But the whole planet. And then the question hits you like a graviton hammer. What happens next? The most common fan projection, the most likely one really, is the dark one. That the Imperium finds out. That the reports make their way through the labyrinth of the administratum, filtered and reworded and sanitized until some bored functionary stamps it viable for reassignment. And then the ships come. The Mechanicus lands, starts carving up the biosphere for sample analysis. The Departmentum Unitorum builds landing zones. The Ecclesiarchy raises a shrine. And bit by bit, the singing stops. The forests fall silent. The rivers thicken with chemical filtration. And soon, no one remembers what the place sounded like before the hymns began. There are countless variations of this ending. Some see exterminatus coming swiftly after, especially if the world has Zenos' life too complex or inconvenient to control. Others imagine slow assimilation, Cogitator compiled harmony protocols to mimic the environment before it's stripped away. There's one particularly bleak fan fiction I read years ago where the entire planet is turned into a pilgrimage site, marketed as the Emperor's Proof. And the natural wonders are reduced to guided tours surrounded by purity seals and voxcasters blaring sermons. Nothing survives but the memory, and even that is caged. But not everyone believes it has to end that way. Some people think there might be a chance, just a chance, that someone would fight to preserve it. That the person who found it would lie, fake the logs, mask the coordinates with warp interference signatures, create a false report. Dead world, too radioactive, no value. Maybe they'd even sabotage the ship on purpose to cover the trail. It's risky, it's desperate, but it's been done before. There are legends, no official records of course, of voidfarers who vanished intentionally, hiding a world so beautiful they couldn't bear to see it fall. There's also the fantasy of protection by power. That maybe a radical inquisitor or rogue magos would step in, not to claim the world, but to shield it. They'd seal the system with defense grids, false warp beacon markers, or psychic cloaks. There's one idea I love in particular, that a choir of bound psychers could create a perpetual illusion around the planet, redirecting any scanning attempts into thinking it's just an asteroid belt. It's technically possible. Dangerous, certainly, but not impossible. And if you had the right people, the right loyalty, maybe you could hold it, if only for a time. Then there's the more poetic view, the it saves itself theory, that the planet, being what it is, knows how to hide. Maybe it has some kind of biospheric defense mechanism. Not a weapon, not a trap, just disappearance. A way of bending perception, memory, probability. You land, you see it, you weep, and the moment you leave orbit, you forget everything. Your records scrub themselves, your mind seals the door, and the Eden slips back into myth, protected by your own inability to recall it. I don't know if that's real, but I want it to be. There's something deeply human about these thought experiments. We know how the galaxy works, we know what the Imperium is, but still, we hope. We imagine someone, somewhere, doing the right thing even when it's impossible. Maybe it's the last remnant of the idealism the Imperium crushed. Maybe it's a rebellion of the heart. Because if we did find a true Eden, the choice wouldn't just be tactical, it would be moral, existential, a test of who we are. Do we destroy what we cannot control, or do we stand in awe and simply let it be? Some fans have written full alternate timelines where such a world was found and protected. In one, it becomes a sanctuary for the lost, deserters, exiles, psychers too damaged to function, a hidden utopia maintained by secrecy and faith in silence. In another, the world is absorbed into the Eldar webway, sealed from real space forever. And in the most heartbreaking one I've read, the Discoverer destroys their own ship after recording a single message. There is something worth saving, and it is not us. That's the dream, isn't it? Not that we find Eden, but that we deserve it. That we can look at something beautiful and not feel the need to own it, reshape it, ruin it. That maybe, just once, in a galaxy that eats hope for breakfast, someone chooses to protect instead of consume. Maybe it's naive, maybe it's fan fiction. But in the grim darkness of the far future, sometimes imagining a gentle hand is the most radical act of all. There's something profoundly human, maybe even tragically human, about the way we yearn for these untouched worlds. We crave them, chase them, write songs and stories and data crypts about them. We imagine their skies, their air, the feeling of stepping onto soil that's never known a bootprint. But deep down, we're terrified of what finding one might actually mean. Not because the world would be dangerous, but because we would be. Because in the moment of discovery, the mirror turns on us. What would we do, really, if we stood in paradise? This contradiction, this dual instinct to both preserve and destroy is what defines us. It's burned into the Imperium's DNA. We sanctify purity, yet we fear it. We canonize lost beauty, but only once it's gone, only once it's safe, sealed in a reliquary and stripped of its teeth. And that, I think, is the core of the tragedy. That maybe, just maybe, we don't believe we deserve anything untouched anymore. That we've made peace with the horror of our own legacy. We dig and burn and terraform, not just to build, but to forget what we're erasing. Because if something older, better, gentler still survives, then we're not just violent. We're wrong. I've talked to other fans about this. Some say that the search for Eden is really a search for a second chance, one last proof that the galaxy hasn't fully slipped into madness. That somewhere, somehow, innocence still breathes. Others argue it's darker. That we seek out these myths not because we want to protect them, but because we need to know they're out there so we can stop lying to ourselves. That maybe the Imperium has lost its way, and we just don't want to admit it without evidence. Either way, the longing is real. You see it in the way even the most hardened tech priests linger on mentions of natural order. In the way inquisitors redact with silence, not fire. In the way rogue traders risk everything for the possibility of something no one else can own. And maybe that's the most dangerous hope of all. That finding one of these worlds would force us to rethink everything. Not just the Imperium, but the species, our values, our systems, what we consider sacred. Because what if purity exists beyond doctrine? What if harmony isn't the result of control, but of its absence? There's a pain in that idea, a quiet guilt, that we've built a civilization so loud, so armored, that we can no longer hear the very songs we claim to be protecting. We've turned survival into ritual, and in doing so, maybe we've forgotten how to live. I don't know if these worlds exist. I hope they do. Not just for what they are, but for what they represent. Because if even one is out there, untouched, unbroken, then the galaxy isn't completely lost. Then we haven't burned it all. Then maybe we're not beyond redemption. And if you've made it this far with me through all the speculation, the theories, the half-whispered names, and deleted logs, thank you. Not just for listening, but for caring. Because in a universe that treats wonder like heresy, sometimes just caring is the bravest thing we can do. If this story made you feel something, if it stirred that quiet part of you that still believes in stars without banners and beauty without chains, consider joining me again. Subscribe to the channel, share this with someone who still dreams. Leave a comment with your own theories, or just a single word, hope. Because in the end, that's what this is about. Not proof, not maps, not glory, just hope. That maybe the galaxy hasn't forgotten how to be beautiful. And maybe, just maybe, neither have we. If you believe these stories deserve to be heard, if you think the forgotten corners of the galaxy matter just as much as its wars and heroes, then help keep this journey alive. Subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next exploration into the hidden myths of the Imperium, and leave a comment with your thoughts, theories, or questions. Every like, share, and word of support helps this channel grow and keeps these quiet, almost lost tales from being erased entirely. Because in a galaxy drowning in silence, your voice can still echo.